Good morning, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Troy Dumoulin. I'll be your presenter today, and we'll be looking at the subject in front of you. I love the graphic that marketing chose. Deep diving into the conversation around optimizing service delivery through cross-functional teams. And we're going to be taking this journey. We're going to come into it from a historical premise first and talk about its application today in modern Agile type DevOps type service management product teams. Okay, so that's our context, and I am your host, as I mentioned, your speaker, Vice President of Research and Development at Pink Elephant. Before we begin, a few logistics and housekeeping items. So this event is being recorded, and so those of you who would like to have this after the fact or share this with a colleague or friend, you'll be having a follow-up email that you'll receive, and the link to the recording will be made available. As well, the slides will be made available in PDF form to you. So the two most popular questions. Yes, it is recorded, and yes, there will be slides after the event, and you can expect to hear from my colleagues at Pink in regards to both of those. During this conversation, I hope it to be a conversation in the sense that we can do some back and forth Q&A. You might have some questions, and I'm glad to take those questions. So you'll find that this platform allows you to put Q&A type scenarios in there. Depending on where we are with the timing of the webinar, I'll try to get to as many questions as I possibly can. And I hope that you do find this interesting and the conversations applicable to your own organizations and environment. So here's our agenda. Here's what we're going to be going through in this time we have together. So we're going to look at the concept of organizational structure and history, because to understand why we need to talk about cross-functional product-oriented teams, we have to look back in history to understand the context of where we've come from, why we have the current org charts we have today, their strengths, but also their limitation. And we'll talk about, from that premise, why multiple industry verticals over decades have been, trying out, experimenting with the concept of cross-functional teams. So you may not be aware that many of the things we use in Agile and DevOps conversations today, such as the conversation we're going to have today about teaming structures, we didn't invent this. We typically adopt and adapt these principles from other industry verticals. In fact, many of the concepts we're going to be talking about today have their genesis in the Toyota production system and lean thinking and lean application. And so we have applied many of those principles to the modern frameworks we have today, whether that's Agile or ITIL service management or DevOps or IT for IT. There isn't, in my opinion, a modern IT management framework today that hasn't been heavily influenced by lean thinking in practice. So that's where we're going to go next, is where do we see this now translating into the Agile DevOps team structure conversation. We'll talk about the emergence of DevOps teams, and then we're going to talk about, in my opinion, perhaps maybe the thing we should start with, which is leading self-managing teams. And why we're doing it at the end is because let me describe where we've come from, how we are where we are today, the challenges we face, this emergence concept, and then if you so wish to have one of these team structures with the self-managing team concepts I'll describe, well, how would you go about leading for one of those? Because I'll make this point right up front. You can create a structure. You can have all the wonderful intent in the world around culture, but in essence, you need to lead for that structure and culture, because in the end, if you don't change your leadership model and style, but you put the structure in place and hope for a different culture, well, I'm sorry, leadership eats structure every day for breakfast. And so we're going to end with the critical success factor for both starting up, enabling and sustaining cross-functional teaming, and these conversations will end with this leadership discussion. All right, so a key concept is that I'm going to be presenting to you ideas and principles, and I claim no ownership or authorship of these things. I'm simply aggregating what is known, what is proven, and key concepts for you to understand their application to us in the IT field and management. Okay, so let's begin with where we all came from as far as structure today. I need to take you back in time. As my friend Jack Probst would say, we have to go back in Dr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. Of course, if you understand that reference, that dates you a little bit, but hey, it's a fun concept. I'm going back in time to really, as you can see, the mid-17, late 18, early 1900s. And this is a time in history that was very unique, a disruptive time in history for industry. or just general community at large, because we were moving from a rural-based kind of agricultural craft-based system, right, to this more industrial, technology-based, city-oriented concept. And as the industry was kind of spinning up, the machines literally spinning up in massive factories, the fathers of, we call them modern day management today, such as Adam Smith and Frederick Taylor, really were struggling with ways to transform. So we talk about digital transformation. Well, this was a industrial transformation, a culture, an economy, an entire operating model from this rural to this industrial complex. And these folks really struggled to do this because they had challenges to overcome like we do today. Now, the three primary challenges that the early industrialists struggled with were around education, technical automation, obviously, and communication. Because the first challenge is this challenge of education. So the knowledge and skills and how to manage and live and operate in this new technological world. We had a workforce that was largely uneducated in that context. Now, they were educated, but they had rural craft-based understanding. So they knew how to milk a cow, plant a field, build a barn, but managing complex technology, not so much. Now, pair that with the next challenge that we bring them into these factories and the level of automation, we're talking hydraulics at best, right? So low automation. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the inability to communicate over large distances in an effective, efficient way. Because imagine a supply chain now of multiple different suppliers providing raw materials and goods, maybe a manufacturing capability that might be distributed over a couple of different plants. And this concept of a supply chain had to be held together with communication technology that was literally telegraph, ... And so these three triple challenges, education, automation, and communication, made them rethink, how am I going to get work done in this kind of now modern, quote-unquote, economy, because it's not really conducive of taking a complex value chain of, let's say, 1,000 steps and asking one person to know the whole thing, right? That's just not conducive. It's not efficient, not effective. So what they ended up doing was something completely different. So in the spirit of task specialization, they created vertical-based org charts. They took this value chain, and if you're familiar with some of the ITIL 4 updates, we talk about value chains. IT for IT talks about value chains and value streams. In essence, this concept of a value chain, which comes from, again, the lean premise, is really the focus of how all work is done. Think about it. It doesn't matter if whether you're the service desk or you're the IT function or you're the brand of your organization, you live inside a value chain. There's demand that you receive on the front end, right? So you have engagement practices. You take all of that demand, and hopefully you're not just receiving demand, you're also influencing demand through being a good partner. You take all that, bundle it up into plan. You got to figure out, how am I going to prioritize this? How am I going to fund it? How am I going to resource it? You move it now through this kind of build activity, could be obtain or buy as well. If you're not building it, maybe a combination of both. You create this capability and you're going to move it live into some production context where it's now available for use and value creation. So in essence, all value is created through these major kind of macro steps. Again, it doesn't matter. It could be the same kind of steps at a one team level, the network team, the database team, or it could be the entire organization you are part of. We all exist on what I call the canvas of a value chain. So what our folks did in the early 1800s, early 1900s was say, okay, let's take up this value chain. Let's segment it up. We're going to actually chunk it up into the major steps. There are going to be people in the front end that kind of deal with customer engagement. Then there are going to be people who kind of sit in towers and think big thoughts and dream big dreams. They're going to be planners. Then we're going to get the people kind of doing the work. They're going to be build, obtain, acquire. And then there'll be some people we just need to run and operate, right? So there's that side too. So we'll create vertical organizational structures based on this. We'll segment it out. And then we're going to do this next thing. What's going to happen is, well, we don't want to teach everyone the whole thing because that's not effective or efficient. So here's what we're going to do. The folks down in any one step, okay, you're a person on the line, all right? So your job will be to, build bumpers. Another person, you're going to do axles. Another person over here, you're going to do steering wheels. And don't worry about anything else because we've got you covered. You got to come in. You know how this craft and guild thing works. You come in. You start your job as an apprentice. You got to kind of do the thing necessary to get the work done at a low or basic or junior level. But then throughout your career, we'll move you up. One day you'll become an intermediate person, a journey person, and then if you play your cards right, you become a master of the guild, a master of your domain of expertise, and you can be on the board of masters and bring young Padawans up through this skill set. And this is how basically we've always, through the thousands of years in a guild-based, craft-based economy, developed mastery. It's focused on task specialization. Now, there's a great thing that comes out of this, right? You do one thing, do it well, and do it most efficiently, effectively. We get high degrees of task specialization. We get great people who do individual tasks. But unfortunately, this concept of structure also decouples you or creates a sense of isolation, or you completely lose sense that the rest of the system even exists. Or if you maybe realize it exists, you have no empathy for it because this is my thing right here, right? I'm told to do this. This is all I do, and that's my thing, right? That's what I'm paid to do. In fact, we double down on this by measuring them only on vertical orientation, right? So someone comes from the axle company or department and says, "Can you help me with an axle question?" Nope, sorry, that's not my thing. I'm a bumper guy, right? So I'm an application developer. I'm a database administrator. I'm a network specialist. I'm a sysadmin. So these concepts of task specialization really were the genesis of our organizational structures we have today, and they come from literally the mid 1800s, and they were put in place to deal with challenges that no longer exist, but we still exist with these structures today. Now, the interesting thing is that while we organize vertically, work actually is delivered horizontally from value creation. And so it's not a challenge to deal with up and down communication in a vertical structure. That's a relatively straightforward chain of command and also communication. It's the handoffs left to right, right? Think about it. It's the cues between groups. It's the sense of this is my tribe and that's not my tribe over there, right? This sense of I am this and this is all that I do. And I've actually reinforced it through measurement and performance management principles. So while it's great at creating, this concept of specialization, it's also great at, unfortunately, creating a sense of silo-based behavior mental models, all right? It even gets worse when we only measure the verticals based on the outcomes of each vertical dimension. Okay, so this is where we've come from. Now we've got to repatriate this concept of a value chain, rediscover it because it's already existing. It's not like it disappeared on us. We've got to put into the folks that are working in these areas of specialization that they're part of a larger context of us. And it's interesting. I'm doing a webinar or presentation at our next conference where this concept of how big is your definition of us is the key concept because there's always an us and a them, right? Where the boundaries of my team stop and then beyond that boundary it's someone else, it's them. And when I want to create shared values, beliefs, practices, and priorities, I have to create this sense of collective us. Because system thinking teaches us that for a system to gain velocity, by the way, that word velocity is an interesting one, speed with direction. All of the agents of that system have to share the same values, the same beliefs, the same basic practices, and the same basis for how they prioritize work if they want to gain velocity, speed with direction. But if they don't do any of those things, they have different values, different beliefs, different practices, different bases of prioritization, it's going to negatively impact velocity. Now, I'll talk about how we already do this in one context. For example, if you want to get work done fast, you pull a project team together. A cross-functional project team with member constituents from the various domains of expertise, right? We got the DBA, we got the sysadmin, we got the network analyst, we got the architect, we got the security professional, we got the developer, we got supplier engagement. We put them all on a team, more on the word team in a moment, and say, okay, for the period of the project, we need to have shared outcomes, shared values, shared beliefs, shared practices, and shared priority. But it's a temporary structure for creating fast flow. because after the project, you go back to your tribe, right? So we've already figured out how that works. We create cross-functional teams, but they're temporary structures for executing work in a higher velocity with shared outcomes. In essence, that's what a cross-functional team is. So let's unpack this word cross-functional team a little bit. So in essence, if you want to get a true cross-functional team, you have to have membership from all the different areas of specialization. You're going to need to receive, plan, prioritize, build and deliver value. In essence, you're gonna need the village to get this done. And at various times, the people who are involved in various specializations will come in and out of the activity, but it means it's not just one specialization group, right? And this sense that I'm now part of something collective, okay, a project. Now I'm going to talk about where projects become products. I create this sense of collaboration. Now, interesting word, collaboration. 3 types of relationship we talk about in the ITIL 4 defining value and delivering value conversation. There's transactional, which is I'll meet you at the door and I'll provide you pizza, right? We have a good relationship, but it's right at the door. There's cooperation. So there's a little bit of convergence here between the provider and the consumer, but we're cooperating for individual needs being met, okay? And so that's an interesting one, because that's like, I've got my needs, you got your needs. We'll work together as long as, it works for both of us. I'll share my cookies as long as it's working for me, but if it's not working for me, I'll take my cookies and go somewhere else. That's to cooperate. To collaborate is we're all in. That's the whole shared values, belief, measurement, outcomes, practice premise. We share both the same objectives for outcome as well as the same benefits and the same risk. And so when we create this now temporary structure in a project, more semi-permanent in a product team, we increase the sense of our team is us, and us is now across all constituent groups and departments, not just software, not just ops, right? And so we orient around a specific outcome. It could be a product line. Now it's interesting, again, we have models where we've seen and done this in our past history in IT. Some of you may remember when your first major ERP system came to town, right? You're going to manage one of these complex, very expensive systems like, Oracle Financials or SAP. And because of the challenges we struggled with at the time and still do around silos and culture and challenges, what we ended up doing to manage this very complex and very important costly system well, efficiently, and effectively was create an SAP team, and literally created a little mini-me IT function. There's people kind of doing the SAP engagement, people doing the planning, people doing the development, people doing the operational aspect, and we created this sense of identity around SAP, the product. And we created a little mini-me IT function over here. And in essence, these were kind of, in some cases, our first cross-functional teams. Some of you may still have this. And so what it avoided was the throw it over the wall to the other team to take the baton, because all of the constituent skill sets were in the same context of this product team in SAP. Now, the reality is they don't all have to be in a mini-me IT function, because you can still have a product team we'll talk about around a certain outcome, and the member constituent is part of a domain-based team, a specialist team like network, but they also have an identity and a relationship to the product, in this case SAP perhaps, right? So they're part of 2 families. And yes, we have a matrix, right? This is a key concept. This is not our first time on the rodeo. So let's talk through the management discussions, because part of cross-functional teaming is this principle of creating a culture that is self-managing versus being directed day-to-day in their task. And around this self-management comes principles of establishing a sense of personal accountability for work, in the sense that my attention to quality matters. It's not I get to do something and someone else gets to catch my outcome. Quality at the source says I'm personally accountable for and have some emotional attachment for the quality of the work that I do. And so this self-management principle ties into this to create this sense of accountability, sense of quality, continual improvement about the work I do. This is where self-managing, we'll talk about, actually comes out of the lean movement again. But again, here's some different forms of management in this conversation. Manager-led teams, this is your traditional top-down directive. You do what your manager says to do. Not a bad thing. It's simply the way we've managed work since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You come in today, I go see my manager. She basically says, here are the priorities today, hands out the work task. At the end of the day, I come back and say, I've done these, what's next? And so I've given my next work task. And so this creates efficient, effective execution, but not necessarily a sense of ownership in the quality of work. Self-management says, well, we know the goal, we know the boundaries, we know the objective. The manager, in this case, maybe the product owner we'll talk about in a moment, has prioritized the work based on some outside context of understanding market and customer value. So you know what work's more important. It's at the top of this kind of product backlog. You don't get to determine where to pull work off, but here's your first decision. You can determine how much to pull off the top in the context of what you believe you can get done and promise to get done within the time frame we call the sprint or iteration. So there's a decision in the context of how much work we pull into the sprint. And when we pull it in, there's a decision about who's going to do it, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to approach it. So while there's a boundary here, the sense of self-managing is given to that team, that individual. Now, self-designing teams are a little bit next level. So self-management has this concept of, to decide amongst ourselves how we'll get something done. Self-managing teams don't decide who's on the team. Self-designing teams have some influence on that. I'm sure that you remember in high school when you did your first group work, there was always those keen people who were always accountable, disciplined, got the project done, and there always seemed to be the people who kind of got pulled along, carried by the rest of the group. Well, a self-designing team would say, this past 3 iterations, 3 of our players haven't been really in it for the team. They've been more in it for themselves. We're going to not invite them back to the island for the next iteration. Now, interesting premise, self-designing teams to create an even higher sense of accountability, personal, mutual accountability to each other. And statistically, historically, what happens is the challenge begins where the self-designing teams, the good teams, get better. But unfortunately, perhaps the underperforming teams get worse because you begin to have this stratification of performance. Right? So this is the concept, the self-designing. A self-governing team is never talked about in any kind of virtuous premise. This is where the team spins off, becomes a completely different organization, and has a belief that it has its own decisioning around who they are, what they value, what the priorities are in the context of their own context, and they decide truth as they see it. Now, think about self-governing. Self-governing, in essence, is to say there are no boundaries. I make up my own boundaries. Now, we're all part of communities, whether you're part of an organizational brand, whether you live in a province or a state or a nation. There's always boundaries. There's policy. There's things we can and things we shouldn't and things we can't do, right? And things we have to do. There's always boundaries in community. Self-governing says we make our own boundaries. There's no authority over us. In essence, it's kind of like a sovereign citizen saying, yes, I live here in the country of the United States, but you're not the boss of me. I make up my own truth as I see it. So no one's ever talking about self-governing. So we're usually talking about in the context of self-managing or self-designing. So these principles of cross-functional teams, again, we didn't make them up. There's been decades of research about the formation of, the concept of measurement, the concept of innovation. And so, again, this comes out of, in some cases, the manufacturing world. And here's an example source when we're creating these cross-functional teams, what they need to be successful and even promote innovation. So first of all, there's always a container. There's the boundary, right? You have a boundary of a product strategy that has been set up between the product owner and the customer. There's a boundary of the budget available. There's a boundary of the time necessary to go to market in order to achieve strategic objectives. So there are boundaries in this context, in this container. So we exist within the boundaries. Now, the key thing when you're putting together a cross-functional team is you're looking to have within that team a high degree of diversity, because it's proven that the more diversity you have on the team, right, then the more opportunity you will have for creative thought and innovative kind of outcomes. So diversity is a better predictor of problem solving and innovation than homogeneity, where we pull a team together of all these people who think the same way, feel the same way, have the same kind of background and history and experience. So diversity is a better predictor of creative solutioning. And we allow this exchange to happen in a very fluid way, not so much this kind of linear or sequential. I've done my work, so now it's over to you, and now I pass the baton to you. And there's a real sense of we get work together done versus I've got my job and you got yours, which will come back to the principle of a T-shaped person in a moment. So these exchanges between the diverse groups within the boundary of containers are the best way of enabling these cross-functional teams. So we see that emerging in concepts like the Agile team, all right? So some principles about the Agile team. So this is a traditional Venn diagram. You've got the product owner, that's he, she, or they, who's managing the product lifecycle, responsible to understand the market on the left-hand side, the consumers that leverage that value creation via the product. And we've got this product owner who's also connected to a development team, where we've got a development team of subject matter people with specializations. We have a scrum master. That's he, she, or they who keeps us on schedule, make sure we show up at our events, we don't skip events, and those events have to be, time boxed, so we focus mostly on planned work, not unplanned work. And so this principle of the product owner in the middle is kind of connecting the left hand with the right. And the concept between product ownership is that I have to know what the left-hand side defines as value. And I establish requirements and prioritization of my backlog based on the left. Now, if we take a lean conversation in here, we've got various voices on the left. We have voice of customer. That's the person who defines requirements. We've got voice of business, the organization that I'm part of and strategic objectives that we want to achieve as an organization. We've got voice of regulation, right? The compliance and regulatory aspects that I need to be able to assert and ensure and conform to. I've got voice of user even, because the UX in the conversation of user experience would be different than I might see in a customer or sponsor. So I get this entire market defining what does good look like, where do we need to go, by when and how, and what are we willing to pay for, right? The definitions of value. And I have to translate that now back into technical terms to the folks on the right. Say, okay, here's what this means and what we've got to build by when, under which constraints, and within which boundaries. And so this perfect product owner is supposed to be the blend of both business acumen on the left and on the right technical skill and knowledge. First of all, it's a fairly rare person to find, right? But the question I want you to think about is if you had to pick, and I wish you didn't, where would you prefer that person be more skilled and spend more of their time, on the left or the right? You probably would say the left, because it's true. That's the higher value work of a product owner, but they bring that back to the team. Now, the principle of the team, right, and the product owner, key concept out of Agile Scrum, is the product owner, in this case, is not a developer. He, she, or they is not a person building. They're spending time more on the left and translating it to the right. So this cross-functional team concept we see in the Scrum team. Now, an interesting other rule of thumb for the Scrum team. So you got this development team. They're made up of specialists from the various domains we talked about earlier. I got my network admin, I got my software developer, my business analysis, I got my InfoSec person. But a key principle of the development team in Scrum is you can't refer to yourself by your job title or your functional team's name, right? You're on the development team, period. Leave your ego and your job title at the door. There's no such thing as this is my job and that's not. Which is interesting because we've got this concept of this cross-functional team emerging in this principle of the Agile Scrum concept. This cross-functional team emerging for collective outcomes and collective goals and achievement. All right, so let's play that forward a little bit. And I do see there's questions coming in, folks, and that's great. I will take those questions at the end of our session. So now let's expand on this a little bit and talk about what would be the difference between an Agile software development team, as described classically in Scrum, to what is in essence referred to, if you read the DevOps literature, as a DevOps product team. All right, so first of all, again, much of what I'm describing wasn't developed or invented in IT. They have been adopted and adapted concepts from other principles. The principle that I'm talking about here was first documented in a paper by what's called the New Product Development Game by two Japanese gentlemen here. And by the way, much of the writing that Jeff Sutherland developed the Scrum model on is based on Lean and Toyota Production System. In fact, he references these gentlemen quite often in his collective work about Scrum and the book he released about a Scrum, how to do twice as much work in half the time. First of all, remember that Jeff Sutherland doesn't come from an IT background originally. He was military initially. He transfers that military organizational context into IT. Again, these things are not, again, developed in IT. They've been adapted by. So here's what the folks in this literature talk about. They say, to have a team be a team, very effective team in that fact, three things would have to be true. They have a transcendent purpose, a collective purpose. There's not the department purpose for the network group versus the developer versus the ops person. We, the people of the team, have a goal to achieve this outcome, and I contribute to that team through my specialization, but there is no such thing as I'm a developer and that's all that I do. That's not how it works, all right? So our us is the concept of the bigger us around the product or outcome. They're autonomous in the sense they create self-management within the context of boundaries, and they're cross-functional. Cross-functional, by its very nature, means they bring to the team the right skill sets, the full set of skill sets necessary for value creation. And so in this context of a full-stack product team, as I'm describing that earlier kind of mini-me SAP function, is a full-stack team of both development and operations. So remember what DevOps was originally supposed to be about, which was I got two tribes. I got the dev tribe over here. I got the op tribe over here. They have completely different values, different beliefs, different practices, different basis of prioritization. Can't we stop the insanity and work together? And so the DevOps movement was born, a convergence of the words dev and ops into a blended family name. And that's what it was supposed to be. The Capulets and Montagues get married. A little bit of drama, some blood on the floor, but in the essence, a DevOps team is a group of people from both dev and ops. Now, since then, we've had conversations, well, what about DevSecOps? And what about architecture? Shouldn't the customer be part of this? Yes, yes, and yes. And so even the word DevOps now is thinking, okay, is that the right name for it? Because we're really just talking about how do we pull together a team of people with the right constituent knowledge to work at collective outcomes. Now, this is what we call the DevOps movement's concept, the early concept of teaming. Now, much of this has been developed again on previous models, and one that's been around for some time. In fact, I wrote an article for this on this concept that's on the Axelos website, the T-shaped versus kind of the pure specialist model, cross-functional principles. So these concepts talk again about the mental model, how we approach work. So there are three types of people that you might want to see, or you could see in your environment. There's the generalist. That's the person who knows many things but has little to no specialization. Okay, this is the generalist, the Jill or Jack of many trades, the master of none. They're good at networking. They understand the holistic picture. They understand how to connect the dots, but they have no specific specialization. So we talk about this in the medical field. You go to a general practitioner for better diagnosis across a more holistic set of complications. But you wouldn't have that generalist necessarily, perform your cataract surgery. They would hook you up and line you up with a pure specialist. In this context, this person does this, right? He has spent their entire life specializing in this one area. There's no better person than that person in this one area. And so we create this sense of specialization as well. Now, really, we want both. Someone who understands and has empathy and is interested in more than what they do, right? This concept of holistic thinking, systems thinking. But I also want on this team someone who brings a talent or a specific skill of specialization. So in essence, what we're describing here is called the T-shaped person. And that's what this is, a practical specialist, where we do have specialization. I'm a developer. I'm a network person. I'm an infosec person. I specialize in creating scripts to promote to production. All right. I'm an architect. But at the same time, I'm aware of, care for, and I'm interested in the objectives and the outcomes of all of us, not just me. Right. That makes me a good team player. So interesting, it begins with a T, because I believe in shared outcomes. Not, it's not my problem now that my BA work is done. Right. Now, the other side of that is, if someone needs an extra pair of hands, I won't say, no, that's not my job. Right. I do bring a specialization, but I have this T-shaped mental model. So if you think back to what we've described so far, what we want on teams is, in essence, is this kind of person who has this mental approach to work that is T-shaped, right? We value generalists, we value pure specialists, but we want cross-functional teams. Think about this. You would want to really populate that cross-functional teams with practical specialists, not pure specialists. Those of you who watched the show, a few years back now, The Big Bang Theory. Sheldon Cooper is a pure specialist in string theory. Ask him about anything else, he doesn't care, right? Now, the interesting thing is, as you move through this concept of T-shape, I start to do work as required, help my team member out when I need to swarm the issue. And I begin to move beyond just awareness of and interest in, but I begin to even develop skill sets. I didn't have a lot of it initially, but now I'm capable. And so this person actually begins to create capability in other areas. So they become pie-shaped and eventually cone-shaped. And now this person contributes substantially to the anti-fragility of the team, because there's no one point of success or failure. This team is creating multiple capabilities. All right, now, how this all ties together. This is an interesting concept, because the concepts of the DevOps team, as I described, by the way, is not often what I see. I'll come back to that statement. But how typically organizations begin to converge is like this. The DevOps have this problem. They have these tribal differences. To throw it over the wall. You don't care about what you develop. I have to catch the remainder. Let's figure out how we're going to do that. Let's create this extended cross-functional team. Let's connect the dev and the ops together. We create this extended cross-functional team. But often we're not wide enough yet. We're still missing some folks. And we also need to create some kind of self-help automation behind this to make it scalable, because the operations roles, they're part of many product teams. Like, how many product teams can you be part of? That'll be an interesting question. Part of the conversation, by the way. So there's a scalability issue that I have to overcome by creating standard environments, artifacts, scripts, a more DIY, do-it-yourself approach to infrastructure as a service. And so we move to this kind of third level when that is stabilized. So thinking about this DevOps movement concept, when I describe this cross-functional full-stack team, that's what, if you read any of the literature, would be described by a DevOps team. But when I go to organizations, this is not what I find, because they've boiled down DevOps to mean CI/CD, which is continuous integration and delivery, which, by the way, is a great thing, but it's its own thing. It's not the totality of DevOps. So it becomes almost focused on a tooling conversation. So what I typically see is this. I go to an organization who's doing DevOps, and they say they are anyway, and I'll find myself a team in the infrastructure space. Their idea of DevOps is CI/CD, tooling, automation, orchestration. So it's all infrastructure. There's no dev. I go upstream and find another group calling themselves DevOps, and it's an application group whose definition of DevOps is, we don't need no stinking ops. At least not you, that ops. We'll do our own ops. So the DevOps means no ops, at least, or I get to choose who my ops are. Or there's this group in the middle that is kind of neither dev nor ops. It's kind of this kind of handover transition team. And that's also an interesting challenge. There's no, in essence, cross-functional team that I've described. And so there's interesting literature out there that describes what are called anti-patterns and positive patterns to this principle of DevOps teaming that I'm articulating. On the left, you've got negative scenarios. On the right, you've got the more positive. On the right, we either come together, we marry the dev and ops together, the Capulet and Montagues, or I got this DevOps team, which is product-oriented, using infrastructure as a service, Now, I've got cousins in ops who I'm leveraging their technology from, or I've got this kind of prototype kind of mode B organization where I pull this little mini-me IT function together, cross-functional team around a specific product as a prototype, right? But that's supposed to be a prototype because we're supposed to basically all move there eventually, not this team to spin off and become its own thing and its own organization. It's really a pilot approach that this is actually trying to get to. So I want to give some time for questions. I'm going to stream through the last few conversations here, but this now should kind of line up with what I've been describing. So you want a cross-functional team that is self-managing, that is working within boundaries, that has this T-shaped mental model versus not my job. If you're going to want that kind of culture and approach, you have to be very intentional about leading for that type of approach. First of all, establishing boundaries is still a part of leadership. What are the boundaries of the container? That's the role of leader. But when it comes to how it's going to be done and how much will be done in a given time frame, that's where self-management comes in. I can't be this directive person who says, okay, I'm here to hand out the work today. Come see me. I'll tell you what's the most important, right? So this changes the way we lead. Because if we put a structure in place, we want to be, cross-functional, self-managing, maybe even self-designing, and we don't change our leadership approach. So we apply a more directive, traditional, top-down leadership approach to that structure. We're going to fail every single time, or at least you're not going to get the value you think you're going to get out of self-management, because now you have a paradox. The leadership style doesn't match the structural element you've put into place. So we've got to move to this more coach, mentor, facilitator, the creator of boundaries, but the remover of obstacles and obstacles and issues. The enabling kind of sensei model we get out of the lean movement, right? This coach approach to leadership versus I'm here, let's get this done, and here's how we're going to do it. Which is interesting because our traditional approach to engineering is that we hire people and put them in positions of leadership because of their engineering skill. And a lot of folks in that role think it's their job to constantly be the engineer for the rest of the engineers, to be the Uber engineer, which is contradictory to things I've just mentioned. So as we look through this teaming conversation, right, let's come back to even what a definition of a team is. I promise we kind of get there in the end. So the definition of a team by Ketchenbach and Smith would be a small number of people with complementary skills, not the same skills, they have different skills. They're committed to this common purpose and set of performance goals, so they have collective measurement, for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. We, the team, have shared outcomes, shared measures, shared values, and a shared sense of prioritization. Now just think about that. You put a project team together, or a product team, as I'm describing it, which is a project team, by the way, that doesn't go away. That's what a product team is. If you get a group of people together, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got a team, because the teaming aspect is part of the mental model of how you approach work itself. So there's lots of leadership out there, literature out there about leadership in respect to teams. Lean IT Association has a wonderful publication you can download for free called Lean IT Leadership. We speak about this in the DevOps leadership course that we deliver as well. And there are books such as Patrick Lencioni's book called, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And if you take those 5 dysfunctions into kind of proactive approaches, there's these descriptors about how do you create this sense of cross-functional teaming that share accountability, that hold each other mutually accountable. How do you lead for that kind of goal? So if you're looking for practical application or information about how to establish a team that works this way that I'm describing, I would highly recommend Patrick's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And when you take those in reverse, are the 5 functions of a team. We create trust, encourage conflict within the boundaries of ideas, not personal attack. We commit to decisions and plans. We hold each other mutually accountable, and we focus on collective results. Right? So this concept of shared outcomes, shared values, shared beliefs. And we, the people, are the cross-functional team, not just my tribe of domain expertise. right? So these concepts come out of this. Now, what we see kind of emerging as the benefits of what I'm describing, right, is we start to move away from silo thinking, because our us is not the department I'm in. Our us is the group that I'm part of, maybe the IT function, or maybe even beyond the IT function, the brand of my organization, because now my us is not just IT in the business, it's we the business, right? We're all internal service partners here. If we drop this sense of I'm IT and that's the business over there and we're somehow different, because we all are internally part of a service organization. We don't say to project managers, you basically now own everything in the project. We still have managers, because that's what a Scrum Master is, by the way. It's a manager of the Scrum process. But we delegate to the right roles the accountability and the authority that goes with that role. Product owner has the budget, has the product prioritization, the life cycle. The project manager / Scrum Master manages us to make sure that we get to the right place and do the right things at the right time in the right sequence. The development team takes personal ownership of their work, sense of accountability and what they promise and what they agree to do. And so we distribute the right work across the different roles. So what does a functional manager now do? Right? Because what happens to this network group manager or the database manager? Because they no longer dictate day to day what everyone does. You place them on this cross-functional team, and we say, okay, so much of your capacity is oriented around that team and outcome. So what am I going to do now? Well, what I should probably have always been doing, but now have the time to do, which is to create capability and competence within my area of specialization, right? So I build the best kick-butt capability for testing or development or operations. I understand that my folks will be part of other teams, these product-oriented teams, but they also are part of my team, and I've got to manage my capacity across both, but in the end, it's the capability that I'm developing. We stop having handoffs between, okay, it's now over to the BA, or now it's over to the tester, because we cross-functionally work the work collectively. That's what the whole Scrum principle is. We move it there as a team versus have handoffs and queues between handoffs, right? And I also do things like create visual management, limit work in progress to increase flow, which is another principle of Lean that we adopt in the whole Kanban methodology. All right, so we get a lot of value out of this. we create a better sense of us, a shared sense of affinity, a collective desire to achieve group outcomes. I get a team versus a group of people who are contributing their area of specialization. Because I'm removing handoffs and queues, I'm actually getting higher flow, better velocity. Because people are more self-managing, because they are now autonomous versus being told what to do every day, they have a sense of quality or accountability and pride in their work. Their sense of their worth of their work goes up. Because I've got people who are not getting into this mindset of this is my job and that's all I do, I don't have an us and them premise, and I'm willing to work as required, right? I stop having those silos, but I also create these people that begin to create knowledge and skill in other areas, increasing flexibility and reducing my fragility as an organization. And of course, when you have more self-managing teams, you don't need the levels of management structure that I needed to before, because I flatten organizations out. In the context of, you don't need 4 levels of management. You still need management, but perhaps not as much. And so all of these things now are true, or begin to become true, as we apply these principles of cross-functional concepts. Now, I know I've kind of gone through a number of ideas rapidly, so let's go to the Q&A area and see what kind of questions we have, and we can kind of expand on a couple of these thoughts. Okay, so I've got a question here from Justin. When talking about manager-led versus self-managing, etc., when you move to those kinds of teams, what happens to the manager from the prior model? Oh, perfect, exactly what I just said. Okay, so imagine, if you will, okay, I've got this product team. Let's call it, I'm going to use a product like maybe it's a CRM product or an ERP product, or it's a power generation product, or it's an online banking product, and it's made up of constituent members. You've got your folks that are developers and people that do the testing and et cetera, people who kind of have the different non-functional voice into the team as well. Now remember, unless you're creating that little mini-me IT function like we used to do in the SAP group, we are creating a structure called the product team, and I've got the product team made up of members of other teams. Okay, so I'm placing that person on this product team as either fully dedicated or partly dedicated, depending on the capacity. So I'm managing my capacity at a domain level to know who should be on those teams and how many teams should they be on. Okay, now that's another interesting premise, because let's say you have a domain-based team and maybe a third of them are cross-functional in their mindset. They have this T-shaped mentality. Well, let's say 2/3 of your folks have this T-shaped mental model, but 1/3 of your folks really are these pure specialists, right? Not my job kind of folks. Well, okay, what do you do with the individual contributor? And by the way, this aligns with another book that you might be familiar with. It's called the Level 5 Leadership by Jim Collins. And he describes levels of contribution of people to an organization. The first level is, the concept of an individual contributor. The next level up is a team player. Well, your T-shaped person is a team player, but you have some folks which are individual contributors. So first of all, think about it. Again, if you get my Sheldon Cooper reference, would you want Sheldon Cooper on a team? Probably not, because there is no team in Sheldon Cooper's lingo. So what can I do with that individual contributor? Well, they stay home and they work on domain work, because I have got the work at home in my own team to get done, as well as the capacity that I lend to other teams for the product outcome. So there's this capacity management premise. And then there's this whole premise of knowledge and skills development. In ITIL 4, we talk about workforce and talent management. So in essence, most of their work now is focused on capability development to ensure they have the right capacity, the right knowledge, and the right skills, and they're positioning people with the right number of, lend-outs to the right teams. That's a full-time job in its own right. And that, in my opinion, is a higher value work than simply saying, here's your job for today, get this done, come back and see me when you want more. Right? That's a higher value activity for management than job tasking. That's a great question, Justin. Okay, Justin also says, leave your title at the door when you're a Scrum team. Is that specific to the people on the dev team, or does that cross over to the product owner, who usually has greater authority and position? Okay, so the product owner is a role, right? And they represent that role I mentioned between the two circles of influence. That's the entire job of the product owner, to connect these two and to bring value to the left by achieving it with a team on the right. But when you think about that development team, which was one of the three roles of the Scrum team, the product owner, the Scrum Master, development team, that principle of leave your job title and your ego at the door specifically focuses on that development team, meaning be a team, don't have the sense of I'm a pure specialist, right? Yes, I'm a BA or have BA skills, or I'm a tester, or I'm a developer, or I provide the compliance and regulatory input from audit. But at the same time, I do that, but I'm not restricted to that work. So there's a sense of it's not my job is the principle around that. That's that T-shaped individual. Okay. Great question. Yes, Mitch, you picked up on the pie and cone shape. That's what happens to T-shaped over time. They develop other areas of competency and capability. Can an ITSM ITIL organization be a true product team? Well, ITSM is simply the principle of defining the management practices for the value chain, right? Now, remember, a lot of the cross-functional responsibilities on a product team are architecture, are information security, are software development. So, yes, absolutely. Really, when we create, and ITIL 4 goes into this discussion, by the way, folks, this sense of cross-functional product orientation. How do I build a team with the right experience, knowledge of, and skills from all of the activities of the value chain? If you've taken an ITIL 4 class, you saw that value chain, the service value chain. And what I like to say when I'm describing it is the key thing about the value chain is that all these pieces must be present to create value, right? You can't deliver value with just one box, one activity. So in essence, that's the basis of this discussion. You need the cross-functional representation. I'm looking at another comment. In my experience with people and project teams, the challenge was topic related to performance appraisal. Who evaluates performance appraisal? Okay, so that's an interesting one. Well, first of all, when you think about performance appraisals, we often talk about even what we call 360 performance appraisals, where we're getting multiple inputs into the performance of an individual, right? So this, in essence, would be aligned with that principle. I have this person on my team. They're involved in multiple projects already. Now these projects might become product teams, because that's what a project team is. It's a product team that's temporary. When I move into product teams, it's cross-functional teams which don't go away. Actually, by the way, there's a great book I would recommend on this subject. It's called From Projects to Products, From Projects to Products by Mick, M-I-K, Kirsten. And he talks about this whole premise that I'm describing in great detail. And so rather than assemble temporary project teams, let's hold up a semi-permanent product team and then do projects within the product team, because I already have a ready-made assembled team with areas of specialization, but collective goals and outcomes around a product outcome. So now I run projects inside my product team, and if I have to, perhaps bring a few more hands to the table, that's another thing, but I don't have to come up with the project team each time, because I have a specialist member in that team that comes from a specialization area, but knows the product personally, that they're involved in intimately. Okay, the author was Mick, M-I-K, Kirsten, and the title of the book is called From Projects to Products. Highly recommend it. So one more question, interesting question. How does incident problem change manager fit in? All right, so when you think about lean, you think about value-based work, that's moving work forward into the value chain. There's necessary non-value work. So there's administrative, there's governance, there's types of work for orchestration. So you need practices like change management to be an orchestrating practice, where multiple product teams are the customers of that. We have, all societies have a first responder community, where we have people who do, first response as their normal job. So they're dedicated firefighters and police officers, but we also have people who are volunteer in that context, right? So part of their work is on the functional team, but they get pulled into incident management on the volunteer basis because they have the product expertise in it. In fact, last thing I'll say, because I'm out of time, is in this context, think about this. In a cross-functional team, as I'm describing it, support can change drastically. Because today what you have to happen is goes on. Someone calls in a service desk call, an incident is reported, and now the service desk basically says, okay, who do I pass this ball to? Who gets the incident? And they take a guess and they throw it at the network team, because obviously everything's a network issue, right? Haha. And then, of course, it doesn't work out. They pass it back and the service desk gets it back in their hand. Okay, what do I do with it next? Let me pass it to the database team. And then the bounce happens. Well, in this context, you have a very different support model possibly. You only have two queues. You got a front queue for the incidents reported at the service desk, and then the incident goes into the product queue, because it's already assembled with cross-functional membership with different skill sets. And so now the product team has to manage, as they always have had to, both planned and unplanned work around their product capability. But now I get visibility into my backlog of both planned and unplanned work. So our queues and our service management tools even become very different as I'm describing it in this concept and structure. All right, some great questions out there, but I have come to the end. So just want to, before we close off today, if you find these topics interesting, I find them fascinating. We describe and discuss this topic in almost every single one of these courses. In fact, this new ITIL 4 class called High Velocity IT, it talks about this concept of creating fast flow by creating structures that limit silos and increase the flow of work between teams. Right? That's one of the goals of high velocity, improve flow. We can do that through structure, in part. Lean leadership, this leading differently, this sensei, the coaching model that I described. The whole principle of DevOps, as originally discussed, again, broader than basic CI/CD, is about how do you take a dev and an ops tribe and blend them together in this conversation of we the people get collective work done. And so all these courses, depending on what flavor you kind of want to take at this question, deal with this exact dialogue, this cross-functional team. And there's several courses coming up, and we have some offers on the table for you to take advantage of. We got to move away from silos, folks. And when we move away from silos, we get better work done faster as a team. And that is a critical success factor for value co-creation. I hope you've enjoyed our webinar. Again, this is recorded, and you will get the deck, so you're going to get both of those. Anyone who has any questions or concerns can contact me afterwards. In fact, I have a great article on my blog, by the way, called The Human Side of Organizational Velocity. It gets into this topic. And the evolution of process governance actually deals with some of the questions around incident, problem, change, service management office, etc. So I wish you all a wonderful day, and take good care and stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.